So in Lab 4, we're going to start talking about electrical activity in muscles and how it relates to the force generated by our muscles. So in order to understand the electrical activity in our muscles, we first want to understand what a motor unit is. So when a muscle contracts, what we actually have happening is several different motor units within any named muscle, say your biceps, being recruited. So a motor unit is a group of skeletal muscle cells, which we can also call muscle fibers, that contract together because they are innervated by the same motor neuron. So in this image, we can see a red motor neuron 2, coming out of the spinal cord and innervating 3 muscle fibers. So these 3 red muscle fibers would consist of a motor unit. So they're not grouped together physically next to each other. They count as a unit because they all receive the same innervation. So they're receiving the same signal. Any given named muscle is going to be made up of several different motor units of different sizes or different numbers of fibers. So our motor neurons release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And when acetylcholine gets released from the motor neuron, this opens up sodium channels, which we remember is how we transmit an action potential. So our action potential, we remember from our study of neurons and our study of muscle, is a flow of ions. So first we have sodium flowing in during our depolarization. And then as the cell repolarizes, we have potassium flowing out to bring our membrane potential back down. Electromyograms are going to be electrodes on the skin that detect this change in charge as it travels down a muscle. So let's look at an example. So here we see a muscle fiber with 2 electrodes on it, spaced a little bit apart. You can see that we have positive charges collecting outside our muscle fiber, and on the inside we see that negative membrane potential inside our muscle cell. So at the beginning, both electrode 1 and electrode 2 are measuring the same thing, where at rest, both parts of the muscle fiber have the same charge. During the initial depolarization, as we start to send an action potential down, what we have happen is that our sodium ions are flowing into the cell, which raises our membrane potential. So we can look at that on our graph. We can also look at that here in our cell. So now we see a change and we see a difference between electrode 1 and electrode 2, which we could register on the computer. As our action potential propagates, we will see that electrode 1, the area beneath electrode 1, repolarizes, so it goes back to normal, but then we have our sodium ions flowing into the cell beneath electrode 2. So again, we see a difference between our 2 electrodes. So we could time the difference between these charges in order to measure how fast this action potential is flowing. We also want to understand reflexes in order to understand how our muscles work. So a reflex is a patterned response to a sensory stimulus. So this is going to happen automatically. It's basically a quick nerve loop. So what happens first in a reflex is that your body encounters a stimulus. So something happens in your environment that your body senses. We've all been to the doctor and had that tendon tap with our knee-jerk reaction. So that might be our stimulus, something hitting our knee. So inside the body, what's happening is we have a sensory receptor that's sensing that stimulus, so that tap, and this is getting sent to integration centers in your central nervous system. So the nerves that travel from the sensory receptor out in your body into the central nervous system are called your afferent neurons. So afferent goes into the central nervous system. Your integration center then creates a response. So this sense of this stimulus gets registered by your central nervous system, and then it sends out a signal to the body to do something. So it sends a signal, an action potential, down your efferent neuron. So efferent means it's going away. So the plan for the response goes down the efferent neuron, and it goes to your effector organ. Depending on what type of response we're trying to create, it'll go to different types of effector organs. So it might be a muscle, it might be a gland. We've talked in lecture about what an effector organ is, and which ones we'd expect to see reacting to our nerves. So this effector organ is then going to muster some type of a response. And so that response is something we can see and something we can measure. There are a number of different classes of reflexes, and some of them are faster and some of them are slower. So some reflexes only have to go to your spinal column, so to the spinal cord. That's the central nervous system part where our integration center is. And then our response goes directly out from the spinal column. So these reflexes are going to be faster because the action potentials don't have to travel as far. Other reflexes have to go all the way up into your brain. So we have cranial reflexes. We also can divide our reflexes based on whether our somatic or autonomic nerves are involved in the reflex, whether it's an innate reflex or conditioned reflex. So you can actually train people to have a reflex to a specific stimulus. So you might have heard in a psychology class or somewhere about Pavlov's dogs, which he trained to immediately start to salivate when they heard a bell. And he did this by ringing a bell every time they ate. And then eventually, all he had to do was ring the bell, and they'd start to salivate, start to produce digestive enzymes, even though there wasn't any food in front of them. Other reflexes, like hitting a tendon and you kicking out, are innate. You don't have to train those, they just happen automatically. And finally, we can have reflexes with a number of different synapses. Some will only involve one synapse, so two nerves, one on either side. And others will be polysynaptic, so there will be more of a chain of responses. So talking about that patellar tendon reflex, so when your doctor tests your reflexes by hitting your knee with a hammer, that hammer hitting your patellar tendon is the stimulus. And what this does is it presses down on the tendon, which actually slightly lengthens your muscle. So it stretches the muscle because it's pulling on it down below your knee. And something called a muscle spindle within your muscle senses that stretch. So when it senses that stretch, it sends a signal through your afferent neuron into your spinal column. Some of the information about this stimulus is going to go to your brain so that your brain knows it happened. You consciously can tell that someone's hit you on the knee. But you also have a direct reflex to a tendon tap. So another thing that's going to happen is that we're going to see that there's a direct loop just into your spinal column from the afferent neuron and then right back out through an efferent neuron. So here in this image, we can see that there's a direct connection, a synapse between our afferent neuron going into the spinal column and the efferent neuron going out to our quadriceps. We can see that there's also an efferent neuron going out to our hamstrings, but that there's an interneuron in between the afferent neuron and the efferent neuron if we're looking at that loop. So our quadriceps contracting in response to that muscle spindle sensing stretch is going to force us to kick back out. And then we can use the hamstring muscle and contract it a second later to pull the foot back in. So bring our foot back down after we kick out. The goal of this lab is to learn how to record myograms, We're going to test some reflexes after we do that. So first we'll sense muscle activity. We'll look at the electrical signals that produces. We'll look at how it's related to force. We'll see that there's a direct relationship between the amount of electrical activity in a muscle and the amount of force that that muscle generates. So if you have more electrical activity in a muscle, you're going to see more force produced. We'll also look at how muscles can get fatigued. So we know from our daily lives that if we use a muscle over and over again, if we try to do 100 push-ups, eventually those muscles kind of give out. And we'll look at what that looks like when we measure it using our electromyograms. And finally, we'll actually do a test of muscle reflexes and think about the concept of proprioception, which is your body sensing its own position. So proprioception is just a word for how your brain is able to tell where the different parts of your body are.